Good morning. This is Business Morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Chimeze Obi Iwagu. If all things were equal, a historic deal to smash down tariff barriers within Africa would have taken off on July 1. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, formally launched just over a year ago in a blaze of optimism, is being braked by the coronavirus pandemic and a thicket of negotiating problems. A new date for January 2021 has been proposed by ambassadors of the African Union's headquarters in Addis Ababa. However, the recommendation has yet to be adopted by heads of states. And with the coronavirus cases now not abating yet, what is the future of the AfCFTA? Where are we? I'm being joined by the Secretary General of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, His Excellency Wamkele Mene. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Mene, for joining us on the show.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, the AfCFTA, which was meant to have commenced on July 1, was shifted to January next year. How ready are we now?
Well, we are still, of course, in the midst of the pandemic. Many borders in Africa remain closed. As you may be aware, out of 55 countries, 42 countries were in either a partial lockdown or a full lockdown. And as I just said a second ago, borders remain closed. So we will have to get through that the border closures first before we're able to make an assessment in terms of how going forward the pandemic, how it will affect our preparations going forward. There is ongoing work that is being done to the extent that we can using virtual means, but the substance of the negotiations, of course, will require that we continue negotiating towards the end of the year, and hopefully, if conditions allow, that we will get back on track and we will start convening meetings again in person. Of course, subject to the health protocols that we would have to adhere to. So it's a very difficult situation that we're in. It's unprecedented. I think everybody recognizes that. However, we have to find a way of continuing our work whilst not compromising the health, of course, of those who will be involved in the work itself.
Now, I know that the month of January is being proposed as a new date for takeoff, but are we clear on the particular date as at now?
Well, the Permanent Representatives Committee and ourselves as a Secretariat recommended to the heads of states that we commence trading from the 1st of January 2021. I believe that the Assembly of Heads of States, the Bureau of the Assembly of Heads of States, I believe they will accept that recommendation because, of course, the recommendation is based on the reality that we are confronting at the moment. There are borders in Africa where trucks are lined up 20, 30 kilometers waiting to transit and to have goods cleared into a particular country. And so this is the reality that we are facing, that borders are closed and goods are not transiting. And it is therefore not possible for us to say with any degree of credibility to say that we're actually trading under the AfCFTA when on the ground the conditions suggest otherwise. But let me just say also that I think it's absolutely critical that governments across Africa are given the space to fight the pandemic. And governments all over the African continent are focused quite sensibly and quite responsibly, in my view. Governments are focused on fighting the pandemic. They are focused on saving lives of Africans, which is the priority for the moment. We will resume our work. We will get back on track in terms of the progress that we were making, and we will work very hard to ensure that we meet the new trading date of January 1st, 2021, of course, where the heads of states accept that recommendation. But I believe that at this time, we should allow governments the space to fight the pandemic and allow them to, and enable them to save the lives of millions and millions of Africans so that we get back on track in terms of our trade objectives when the conditions allow.
Now, how many countries have ratified the agreement so far? I know economic heavyweights such as South Africa and Egypt, and middleweights including Morocco, Kenya, and Ivory Coast have ratified. But Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa with around 200 million people, still has not ratified, nor have Algeria or energy exporter Angola. Does this worry you?
Well, first, let me just say that there are 28 countries that have ratified the agreement. And as you correctly pointed out, Nigeria has not yet ratified the agreement. We respect the fact that each and every country has got to take its own sovereign decision. And we respect and understand that countries go through different domestic processes to get to the point of ratifying an international agreement, which will be legally binding for many, many years to come on that particular country. And so it's a very deliberate process that each country has to undergo. And I think we should allow Nigeria the space to conduct its own domestic consultations to be able to get to a point where Nigeria is in a position to ratify the agreement. You will remember that Nigeria was probably one of the leading voices in the negotiation of this agreement. My dear brother, the late Ambassador Osakwe, was the chairman of the negotiations, and he led that effort in a very good way. And so Nigeria was part of this process. Nigeria was part of the negotiation process and continues to be a very important pillar, of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And we will work with the authorities in Abuja to address any continued specific concerns that they may have. We will also work with the private sector that may also have some concerns. I understand that there are significant concerns. I have had discussions myself with authorities in Abuja. I have been, before I took on this role, I was in Abuja twice in 1 year to discuss with the private sector and also with the government officials the African Continental Free Trade Area and the role of Nigeria, the very critical role of Nigeria in the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I will continue to engage with the authorities in Nigeria, because I think that it is very important that Nigeria becomes part of this agreement. My role is to make sure that where there are specific concerns, that we address them, and that we address them in a satisfactory way that will provide comfort to the private sector in Nigeria, provide comfort to the government in Nigeria. And so we will work very hard to make sure that Nigeria takes its rightful place in the leadership of the African Continental Free Trade Area, like the other countries that you've mentioned. I should say that the concerns that Nigeria has are not actually unique to Nigeria. There are other countries on the African continent who have not yet ratified, who also have similar concerns around the issue of transshipment. And so we will work with those countries too to provide the assurances that they require. So this is not this is not unique to Nigeria. The concern on transshipment, it is a concern that all countries share. It is a concern that I share. We do not want this agreement to lead to job losses. We want this agreement to create jobs. And therefore, to the extent that there are significant concerns around the issue of transshipment, we have to address that over and above the provisions in the agreement that actually, at the moment, safeguard against transshipment. And so if we need to do more, I think we should be able to do it. If we have to introduce stricter measures in accordance with international best practice, which I believe we already have, but if we need to look beyond the specific provisions that we have at the moment, then we certainly should do that. Because I want to stress that we do not want this agreement to lead to job losses. It must create jobs. It must not lead to displacement of domestic markets. It must create new markets in the region, in Africa. And that is why I think it's very critical, that it's of critical importance that we address the concerns that Nigeria has.
All right, Your Excellency, there is a resurgence of protectionism lately, and of course the COVID-19 experience is not helping matters with the disruption of global supply chains. Are you worried about this?
Well, I believe that actually when you look around the world, I think Africa has taken a very, very different approach to COVID-19. Yes, borders are closed. That is of necessity. It's a public health requirement. But when you look at the evidence, Africa has negotiated, and there's an international agreement, a Pan-African agreement that has entered into force that requires countries to reduce barriers to trade, to reduce barriers in Africa, to reduce barriers to intra-Africa investment. And I think that this is going to continue. We are building on the progress that has been made in each regional economic community. And so the liberalization of intra-Africa trade and the liberalization of intra-investment trade as a matter of law is going to continue. And law in this case is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It is the trade law that all of us have accepted. It requires that we liberalize and that we progressively liberalize intra-Africa trade and intra-investment trade and so on. I don't expect that, that there will be a reversal of that trend. In fact, what we have is all heads of states in Africa, the Assembly of Heads of States, very, very much committed to intra-Africa trade. The Assembly of Heads of States, the political will is there to reduce barriers to intra-Africa trade, to ensure that we enhance Africa as a whole as an investment destination, so that we create millions and millions of jobs up and down this African continent, and we create jobs that are labor intensive, decent jobs, so that young Africans can benefit from this agreement. I know that all heads of states in the African Union, in the Assembly of the heads of states, all of them recognize that. All of them are committed to the African Continental Free Trade Area and its objectives, which is why out of 55 countries, the agreement has been signed by 54 countries. I don't think we can require a higher level of commitment than we have seen of 54 countries out of 55 signing the agreement. 28 countries have already ratified the agreement. But for COVID-19, I believe there would have been more ratifications that we would have seen leading up to the end of the year.
Now, compliance with rules of origin is perhaps the biggest worry about AfCFTA. What framework is in place to ensure compliance?
Well, we are almost at the conclusion. And again, but for COVID-19, we're almost at the conclusion of negotiating a regime on rules of origin. The rules of origin will be very strict. The requirement for value addition is very, very high. We do not want a shirt to come into the AfCFTA area, you put a button on it and you say made in the AfCFTA. We want value addition in Africa. We want industrialization in a massive scale in Africa. We want rules of origin to foster the establishment of regional value chains for manufacturing, regional value chains and manufacturing centers of excellence throughout the African continent. It's of critical importance. So we look at rules of origin as an industrial development tool, but we also recognize that rules of origin are very important for preventing and mitigating transshipment, fraudulent invoicing, and all of these things that lead to job losses. So this is a very sensitive area. We have to be very deliberate about it. We have to be very careful about it because, as I said earlier, it can create job losses, and we do not want this agreement to create job losses. We are going to implement the rules of origin working with customs authorities in individual countries and also with regional economic communities, because implementation of rules of origin and a rules of origin regime, it cannot be done by a secretariat. It has to be done by an individual country at a national level. So we will work very closely with customs authorities to develop the capacity to implement the rules of origin. We will work very closely with them to ensure that we improve the enforcement capability of our customs authorities. I think that's key. This is a new agreement. There's not a single customs authority in Africa who has experience of implementing the rules of origin of this agreement. And therefore, we have to expect that there is a requirement to build the capacity of customs authorities to ensure that they are able to enforce the rules of origin, to keep out of Africa third country goods that are not the legal beneficiaries of this agreement. We do not want goods from third countries to benefit from this agreement. The goods, the exports that benefit from this agreement must be AfCFTA exports.
All right. Now, some countries are already signatories to other trade agreements, such as the EPA. How are you going to reconcile the issue of multiple membership of trading blocs? Does this not pose a conflict?
Well, the agreement makes provision and recognizes that there will be pre-existing trade agreements. There will be pre-existing international commercial arrangements that individual countries will have. And therefore, we cannot escape that reality. The agreement will coexist with existing agreements that individual countries may have. There has got to be that coexistence. There's no other way around that. Entering into an international agreement is an act of sovereignty. So you cannot stop a country from entering into a different trading arrangement, but you can set up, you can establish mechanisms for coexistence of those international trade agreements. And as I say, the agreement makes provision for that. Each country will have to implement both the Economic Partnership Agreement or any other international agreement along with the AfCFTA. And that means that the customs, again, it comes back to the issue of customs. That means that from a customs authority point of view, the country will have to have the capacity to implement all of these in some cases, competing obligations. But this is purely an issue of national sovereignty, especially in the context of pre-existing agreements. The goods that are allowed to be exported under the EPA or any other economic partnership agreement or any other international agreements, those will continue to get market access, subject, of course, to the conditions of the economic partnership agreement. We don't expect that individual countries will vacate the economic partnership agreement. That is purely an issue of the sovereign state. We do not interfere in those matters. What we want to make sure is that this agreement amongst Africans, it boosts intra-Africa trade, it creates jobs for young Africans, and it actually makes a contribution to Africa's industrial capacity and improving Africa's industrial capacity. That's what we are focusing on.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency, for sharing your thoughts on those issues with us. We hope to have you back on this channel, perhaps when you're ready to take off with this agreement. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Yeah, His Excellency Wamkele Mene is the Secretary General of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat.